The station was alive with noise, yet beneath the noise there was a quiet weight of suffering that hung in the air like smoke after fire. Refugees from different worlds moved through the metal corridors, their faces hollow, their bodies wrapped in worn cloth, their eyes searching for hope that was not there. The massive orbiting structure had once been built as a trade hub, a place of exchange and prosperity, but now it had become something different, a shelter for the hungry, a cage of survival where every day was measured in rations and the sound of empty stomachs. When the human supply vessel docked that day, a stir went through the crowds. Hope was rare, and even the sound of heavy crates being unloaded was enough to make the weak lift their heads. The smell of processed food carried faintly through the station, mixed with the sharper odor of recycled air, and it made the hungry almost dizzy. Children with thin arms and swollen eyes pressed against the barriers to watch the humans in their clean uniforms move crates down the loading ramps. Among them was a mother who held her child close. Her skin was pale gray, stretched tight over bone, her movements slow as if every step cost her strength she did not have. The child clung to her, silent, eyes too large for his small face, his head resting weakly against her chest. She had waited 3 days for the ship to come, and in those days, she had given away her own share of thin broth to the child, leaving herself with nothing but pain in her stomach and dryness in her throat. She had known hunger before, but never like this. This was the kind of hunger that stole the will to live. The humans worked with efficiency, stacking containers, checking lists, speaking into comes. Most of the refugees did not dare approach them, because rules were clear and punishments were harsh. The food was for the registered, the counted, the approved. Any begging outside the lines was met with cold warnings, or worse, silence. Still, the mother stepped forward. Her legs trembled, but she moved toward one of the human workers who was adjusting the seals on a crate. He was not special among his own people. He was young, his face plain, his uniform smudged from lifting boxes, his expression tired from long-duty shifts. Yet to her, he was more than that. He was a chance. She lowered her head, her voice breaking as she whispered words that almost caught in her dry throat. "Please. Just the leftovers. My child has not eaten in days." The words were quiet, but they carried more weight than any shout. The human worker froze for a moment, his hand still resting on the crate, his eyes shifting toward the woman and her child. He had heard many voices on this station, voices demanding, voices bargaining, voices angry, but this one was different. It was thin, almost disappearing, yet it had a kind of strength in its honesty. He looked down at the child, and something stirred inside him. The boy's face was so fragile it seemed as if even a gust of recycled air could break him. The hollow cheeks, the half-closed eyes, the way his small fingers curled weakly against his mother's robe. All of it pressed against the human's memory, like an old wound being touched again. He remembered stories from his own people, of cities on Earth where children had once starved when crops failed, of mothers who gave away the last bread to keep their little ones alive. Those stories had always been told as warnings, as lessons of what humanity had overcome. But standing here, he realized they were not so far away. The past had only shifted shape. For a long moment, he did not speak. The station guards were nearby. The cameras above blinked red as they scanned. He knew the rules. Supplies were logged by number and weight. If something went missing, there would be questions, and questions led to punishment. He was just a worker. Not a commander, not someone with power to change orders. But he was also human, and humans carried a strange fire inside them. A fire that refused to look away when injustice stood in front of them. The mother's eyes lifted to meet his. They were not human eyes. They were dark, with no whites pools of shadow that reflected light in odd ways. Yet what he saw in them was something familiar, the desperation of a parent willing to break, Every boundary for the sake of a child. That look was older than species, older than stars. The human swallowed, his throat tight. He wanted to give an answer, but words did not come easily. Instead, he bent slightly as if checking the lock on the crate, using the movement to hide his expression. He whispered under his breath, low enough so the guards would not hear. Not here. Wait. The mother's lips trembled, her knees nearly gave out, but she tightened her grip on her child and stepped back into the crowd. She understood. She would wait. She would wait as long as it took. The human finished his task, his motions slow. His mind racing. Around him, the other workers did not notice. They moved crates, signed off lists, carried on with routine. But for him, routine had been broken. Something had entered his life that was not part of the schedule, not part of the orders. He felt the eyes of the refugees on him, not only the mothers but many others. They were silent, but their silence was heavy, filled with unspoken pleas. He felt as though the station itself was watching him as he carried another crate down the ramp. He glanced once more toward the mother. She stood still among the others, her child's head resting on her shoulder, her figure half hidden in the crowd. He knew then that this was not just about one meal or one leftover. It was about something deeper, something that could not be. Written in ration books. And though he did not yet know it, that single whispered plea would change more than one life. It would ripple outward through the metal halls of the station, through the guarded rules of supply and demand, through the hearts of many who had forgotten what compassion looked like. It would become the spark that would test what it meant to be human among the stars. The station did not sleep, though many inside it dreamed of food and warmth they no longer had. In the long hours after the supply crates were stacked, the air of the docking bay grew quieter, filled only with the sound of machines humming and distant footsteps echoing through steel passages. The human worker remained at his post, pretending to check seals and fill reports, but his thoughts returned again and again to the mother and her child waiting in the crowd. He had told her to wait, and he knew she still lingered somewhere in the shadows of the station, holding on to that small promise like it was life itself. He tried to force himself to focus on duty. The rules were written clear, each ration marked, each number recorded. He had been told many times that rules held the station together, that without order there would be chaos, and chaos would bring ruin. He had believed those words because they carried the weight of authority. Yet now those same words seemed weak compared to the sight of hollow eyes and trembling hands. He thought of the boy's frail body pressed against his mother's chest, and he felt shame because his own stomach was full, his body strong, and yet he had done nothing but whisper a promise. He walked through the dim corridors where the storage rooms lay. The lights flickered with a dull yellow glow. The crates stood silent like sleeping giants, each one heavy with food that could fill the stomachs of dozens. He knew the exact amount inside, had counted it more than once, and knew also how much would spoil if left unused. There were always scraps, always leftovers, bits that no one tracked closely. He had seen them thrown into the waste chute, food turned into nothing while hungry eyes looked on. That memory pressed on him now like a hand against his chest. Bent down and unsealed a container at the far end of the room. The smell of nutrient bars and dried grains rose to meet him, rich compared to the sour metallic air of the station. He picked up one of the packs, holding it in his hand, weighing it as though it were heavier than it truly was. He thought of the child, of how such a small package could mean the difference between life and death. But his hand shook because he knew what it also meant for him. If he was caught with it, the punishment would not be light. A worker caught breaking rations could be stripped of pay, locked away, even expelled from service. Out here, far from Earth, punishment often meant being cast out into the very hunger he was trying to fight against. Still, the image of the mother's eyes stayed with him. They had not begged loudly. They had not shouted or cursed. They had whispered, and in that whisper he had heard more strength than in any order barked by officers. Slowly he slipped the package into his uniform pocket. His breath grew shallow as he closed the crate, resealed the lock, and forced himself to walk as though nothing was different. His every step echoed in the empty corridor, sounding louder than it should, as if the station itself was listening. When he returned to the main hall, the crowd of refugees had thinned. Some had curled into corners to rest on metal floors, too tired to wait any longer. Others had wandered back to their makeshift shelters deeper inside the station. But the mother was still there, her figure small among the shadows, her child limp in her arms. Her eyes lifted when she saw him, and though she did not move closer, he felt the weight of her hope pressing against him from across the hall. He walked past her without looking, his heart racing, until he reached a narrow side corridor where no guards stood watch. Then, with a small gesture, he signaled for her to follow. She moved quickly despite her weakness, holding her child tightly, her steps light so as not to draw attention. Together they entered the corridor where the hum of machines drowned their voices. There he slipped the package into her hand. For a moment she did not breathe. Her long fingers curled around it as if afraid it might vanish. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Then her eyes filled with a glimmer that was not only tears but something brighter, something close to life. She lowered her head, whispering words in her own tongue before struggling to form them in his language. "Thank you," she said. "You give more than food." The child stirred faintly, smelling the package in her arms, his weak hands reaching for it. She opened it carefully and pressed a piece of the bar to his lips. He chewed slowly, clumsily, but the color in his face shifted just a little, as if the food was pulling him back from the edge of darkness. The human worker watched, and for the first time in many weeks, he felt something lift in his chest. Feeling that reminded him of why he had joined the supply corps in the first place. But the joy was short-lived. A sound came from the other end of the corridor, heavy boots against metal. He stiffened, motioning for her to hide against the wall. A guard appeared, scanning the corridor with tired eyes, a data pad in hand. The human worker forced himself to step forward casually, pretending to inspect a panel. The guard passed without suspicion, but the moment reminded him of the danger that hung over them both. The mother seemed to understand. Her expression carried gratitude, but also fear. She knew that his act of kindness could cost him everything. She whispered again, softer this time, "I do not want harm for you." He shook his head. "It is already done." He needed this more than I did. She held his gaze, and though no more words passed between them, a bond had been formed, something unspoken but strong. She slipped back into the shadows with her child, and he returned to his duties with hands that trembled slightly. Yet, what he did not know was that eyes had been watching. Among the crowd, whispers had begun to spread. A human had given food, not through orders, not through trade, but through compassion. The rumor traveled quickly through the station's refugee decks, from mouth to mouth, growing with each telling. For many who had lost all faith in kindness, it lit a small spark. For others, it planted questions about why humans acted differently, why they risked themselves for strangers. As he returned to the docking bay, the human worker felt the weight of those whispers, though he could not yet hear them. He felt the station shift in a way he could not name, as though something fragile but powerful had begun to stir in the hungry silence. And though the child ate only a few bites, those bites were enough to begin a change that would not be easily undone. The days that followed moved like slow tides through the hollow station corridors. Life went on with its ordinary rhythm of guards patrolling, workers unloading, and refugees waiting for the next ration call. But beneath that surface, a new current was forming. The human worker felt it in the way eyes lingered on him a little longer, the way whispers faded whenever he walked past. He told himself it was only his imagination, but deep inside he knew that his quiet act of kindness had not remained hidden. Word traveled faster than sound in places where hunger lived, because the starving carried nothing heavier than hope, and hope could not be locked away. He continued his shifts as always, but his heart was no longer steady. Every time he touched a crate, he thought of the boy chewing weakly at the food, of the way the mother's hands had shaken as she held the package. That memory warmed him, yet it also weighed on him, because now each sealed box looked less like cargo and more like a cage holding life hostage. He wanted to do more, but the risk pressed down on him like gravity. One mistake could cost not only his freedom but his life. Still, each night as he lay on the narrow bunk in his quarters, the sound of the child's faint chewing echoed in his head and pushed away sleep. It did not take long for the authorities to notice the numbers. The station kept records with precision. Every shipment was scanned, logged, and tracked. When a handful of ration bars could not be accounted for, officers began to ask questions. They summoned the workers one by one, asking if any had noticed strange behavior, if anyone had seen food slipping away. The human sat in that room with the cold lights above and gave calm answers, his face steady, though his heart beat fast. The officer who questioned him studied his eyes, perhaps sensing the weight behind them, but finally waved him out. He walked away with his back straight, though the sweat at his neck told another story. Outside that room, he saw the mother again. She stood farther down the hall, her child leaning against her side. The boy looked better, his face no longer as hollow, though still weak. She did not speak, but their eyes met, and in that silent exchange he felt something rise in his chest. That was both pride and fear. He turned quickly before the guards noticed, yet the warmth of her gaze stayed with him. But whispers grew louder. Others in the refugee decks began to approach him in secret, eyes full of desperate pleading. Some only stared at him as if he were already carrying their hope in his hands. Others found small chances to speak when no guards were near. They spoke of children with ribs like cages, of elders fading away in silence. Each story tore at him, because he knew he could not help them all. One act of kindness had been dangerous enough, but to repeat it again and again would draw the fire of authority down upon him. Yet how could he look into those eyes and turn away? One night as he left the storage hall, a figure stepped from the shadows. It was not the mother, nor any of the hungry who had whispered to him before. It was an older man, another human worker, his face worn with lines from years of labor. The man's eyes narrowed as he spoke in a low voice. "I know what you are doing," he said. "You think nobody sees, but someone always sees. They will catch you soon." The younger worker froze. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to answer. "Then why tell me now instead of reporting me?" The older man sighed, his voice softer. "Because I remember when I was like you. I gave away bread once, a long time ago, to a woman with a sick child. It cost me half a year of wages. I never forgot the look in her eyes, and I never forgot the punishment either. Be careful. They will not forgive you." The younger worker felt the warning like ice down his spine. He nodded, but inside him the fire refused to go out. If the older man had once taken the same risk, then it meant he was not alone. Perhaps the urge to help was something buried deep in every human heart, something that could not be erased by fear. The next day, he saw the mother again. She stood in the ration line, waiting her turn like everyone else, her child pressed close to her side. She did not step out to beg, did not even glance at him directly, but he could feel her presence like a quiet anchor. He wondered if she understood that she had started something larger than herself, that her whisper had cracked open the wall of silence on the station. That night he smuggled out another small package, slipping it into a hidden corner where she could find it later. When she retrieved it, their eyes met only briefly, but in that brief moment he felt her gratitude pour into him like strength. He told himself it would be the last time, that he could not risk more, but deep down he knew. The lie. Each act made it harder to stop, because each act reminded him that rules meant nothing if they allowed children to starve. But the net was tightening. The officers spoke sharper now, their inspections grew longer, and guards were assigned closer to the storage halls. Cameras blinked red more often, their lenses following every movement. The worker felt their gaze on his back as he carried crates, felt the cold suspicion in their silence. He knew he was being watched, yet he could not bring himself to stop. And so it happened that one evening, when the corridors were dim and the shift almost over, he slipped a package under his jacket and turned toward the shadows where the mother waited. He moved quickly, his steps careful, his heart hammering. He reached the corner where she stood, her child dozing in her arms, and pressed the package into her hand. She looked up at him with quiet relief, but before either could speak the sound of boots filled the corridor. The guards rounded the corner, their eyes sharp, their rifles gleaming under the pale lights. One of them barked an order for him to stop. His body went rigid. The mother gasped softly, clutching the package to her chest. The child stirred, half waking. The human worker knew in that moment that he had been caught, and all the danger he had tried to ignore now stood before him in flesh and steel. Yet even as the guards approached, even as their hands reached for him, he did not regret what he had done. The memory of the boy chewing, the sight of life returning to his small face, was stronger than fear. And in the silence before the storm of punishment fell, he wondered whether his single act of defiance could spark something greater, something that no guard could ever stop. The guards closed in with heavy steps that made the metal floor ring beneath their boots. The human worker felt his pulse hammering against his ribs, but he forced himself not to run, because running would be the same as admitting guilt. He raised his hands slowly and tried to steady his breath as the two men with rifles pointed their lights toward him. The mother froze behind him, clutching the child to her chest and hiding the package against her body as if her own skin could shield it from discovery. "What are you carrying?" one of the guards barked. His voice was sharp, trained to cut through lies before they were spoken. "Nothing," the human worker replied, his voice calm though inside he trembled. "Just finishing my shift." The guard's eyes narrowed and his hand moved to search him. The worker felt the rough grip pulling at his jacket, but by some stroke of chance, the guard's search stopped short when his comm unit buzzed with a sharp signal from the command post. There had been a disturbance on the other side of the station, and the guards were ordered to respond. The man released him with a glare, muttering a warning. "You are being watched. Do not forget it." The two guards turned and hurried down the corridor, their boots fading into the distance. The worker let out a slow breath he had been holding. His shoulders sagged with the weight of the narrow escape. The mother whispered softly behind him, words he could not understand in her own tongue, but he knew they were words of thanks and fear mixed together. He turned to her, his voice low. "You must be careful. They will catch us if we continue like this." She shook her head and held out the package. "If it puts you in danger, I cannot take it." But he pushed it back toward her, his eyes firm. "Your child needs it. That is reason enough." She hesitated, then accepted it again, pressing it to her chest. Her eyes shone with quiet strength, and for a moment he felt that he was the one being given something, not her. He turned away quickly before the emotion could overwhelm him and returned to his quarters with his mind heavy. That night he could not sleep. He lay in his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling while the station hummed around him. He thought of the guards, of the warning, of the eyes that now followed him in every corridor. He thought of the refugees whispering his name, though he had never given it to them. He thought of the mother and the child and the way hope had returned to their faces. And he realized he had reached a line that could not be walked back. The next day, the officers called a meeting in the docking bay. All workers were gathered under the cold light of the overhead lamps. The commander stood tall, his uniform spotless, his expression stern. He spoke of missing supplies, of stolen food, of thieves among them. His voice carried across the hall like a blade. He said someone would answer for it, that order must be restored, that rules were the shield that protected them from falling into chaos. As he spoke, the refugees were kept outside the barriers, but their faces pressed against the transparent walls. They watched with hollow eyes, waiting for what would happen. The commander ordered inspections to begin. Workers were searched one by one, crates checked, records examined. When the human worker's turn came, he stood tall though fear churned inside him. The commander looked at him directly, as if sensing something. The silence stretched long, until at last the commander moved on. For that moment he was spared, but he knew it was only a matter of time. Later, as he walked back through the refugee decks, he saw the mother again. She stood with her child in her arms, the boy now able to lift his head and look around with clearer eyes. The sight gave him strength, even as his fear deepened. He realized that the child's survival was already known among the refugees. They looked at him differently now, not only as a worker, but as a symbol of defiance against hunger. That evening, when he returned to the storage hall, he found not only the mother waiting in the shadows but two others as well. A father with 3 children and an elder who could hardly stand. Their eyes all begged the same silent plea. He hesitated, his hands trembling. To help one had been dangerous, but to help many would be impossible to hide. Yet how could he turn away now? The fire inside him burned too strongly to be smothered. He opened a crate and slipped out several small packages. He passed them quickly to the waiting hands, urging them to leave fast. They took the food with tears and whispers, vanishing into the dark. The mother lingered a moment longer, her eyes meeting his with both gratitude and worry. Then she too slipped away with her child. But unknown to him, the cameras above recorded every move. The next morning alarms rang through the station. Workers were gathered again, this time with armed guards lining the walls. The commander's face was cold with fury as he spoke of betrayal within their ranks. He announced that someone had broken the trust of the station and placed everyone at risk. His words were followed by an order that cut through the hall like thunder. Bring him forward. 2 guards stepped out and pointed directly at the human worker. Gasps rose from the crowd. He felt his legs stiffen, yet he forced himself to walk forward, his head high. The refugees pressed closer to the barriers, their faces pale, their hands gripping the glass. Among them he saw the mother, clutching her child, her eyes wide with fear. The commander glared at him. You have been caught stealing from the supplies meant to sustain order. Do you deny it? The human stood silent for a moment. Then he spoke clearly so that all could hear. I do not deny it. I gave food to the starving because they are dying before our eyes. What good are rules if children waste away behind them? What good is order if it demands we ignore suffering? A murmur spread through the hall, voices rising from both workers and refugees. The commander silenced them with a wave of his hand. His face hardened. You have broken the law. You will face punishment. The guards moved to seize him. But before they could, a voice rang out from among the workers. Another human stepped forward, his voice firm. If he is guilty, then so am I. I will not stand by while children starve. Then another worker spoke, and another, their voices joining together. Even some of the refugees shouted from behind the barriers, their voices weak but filled with courage. The hall filled with sound, a rising wave of defiance that the commander could not silence. The human worker felt their support surround him, stronger than the fear that had held him before. He stood taller, his voice carrying over the noise. We are not thieves, we are not criminals. We are human, and to be human is to share. The commander's face turned pale with anger, but the tide had already shifted. The guards hesitated, uncertain. The crowd's voices grew louder, echoing through the station, breaking the silence of hunger with the sound of rebellion. And in that moment, the human worker knew that the path he had chosen could no longer be hidden in shadows. It stood in the open now, burning bright for all to see. The air inside the docking bay shook with voices that would not be silenced. The commander tried again to call for order, but his words were drowned by the rising tide of sound that filled the hall. It was not the sound of weapons or machines, but the sound of hunger finally breaking its silence, of hope forcing itself into the open. Refugees pounded their hands against the transparent barriers while workers raised their voices, one after another, until the hall echoed like thunder trapped inside steel walls. The guards shifted uneasily, their rifles still in their hands but their eyes uncertain. They had been trained to obey orders, but they had not been trained to face the roar of both the hungry and their fellow humans standing together. The commander shouted for calm, but his voice carried less weight now. He had power only as long as fear held control, and fear was beginning to slip away. The human worker stood in the center of it all, his hands still bound but his back straight, his face calm even though his future was balanced on a knife's edge. He looked toward the refugees, and his eyes found the mother once again. She held her child close against her chest, and though her body trembled, her eyes were steady on him. That silent strength gave him courage to speak again. "You say I have broken the law," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. "Maybe that is true. But what is law if it demands that children die for the sake of numbers on a page? What is order if it feeds silence while stomachs go empty? We humans came to the stars not only with machines and ships, but with something more powerful than both. We came with the will to care even when rules tell us not to. That is why we are here. That is why we lead. If kindness is a crime, then I will accept the punishment, but I will not be ashamed." The hall went quiet for a breath. His words hung in the air heavier than any weapon. Then the sound rose again, stronger, clearer. Workers shouted their agreement. Refugees cried out with voices raw from hunger but filled with new strength. Even one or two guards lowered their weapons, unable to ignore what they were hearing. The commander's face grew tight with anger, yet even he could feel the shift in the air. Authority rested on the obedience of the many, and when the many no longer obeyed, authority cracked. He barked an order for the guards to seize the worker, but they hesitated. The hesitation spread like fire from one to another until not a single boot moved forward. They had heard the words as clearly as everyone else, and though they wore the uniform, they were not made of steel. They too were human, and in their eyes flickered the same fire. The commander's voice faltered. He looked around and realized he was standing alone against a sea of faces that no longer feared him. His power drained from him like water slipping through open hands. At last he lowered his hand and gave a sharp order for the meeting to end. The guards stepped back, uncertain but relieved. The commander turned stiffly and walked out of the bay, his authority still on his shoulders, but cracked like glass under. Wait! The hall erupted. Refugees pressed forward against the barriers until at last the controls were released and the gates opened. Workers rushed to them, sharing words, sharing hands, some even breaking open crates to pass food freely for the first time. The human worker's bonds were cut by one of his own comrades who whispered quietly, "You have given us more than food today. You have given us back our voice." The worker stood among them, unsteady with the rush of it all. He felt arms patting his shoulders, heard voices thanking him, saw eyes filled with tears. Yet his gaze searched only for the mother. At last he found her in the crowd, kneeling on the floor with her child before her. The boy ate from the package he had given, his small hand steady now, his eyes brighter than before. The mother looked up as the worker approached, and their eyes met in silence. She rose slowly, her child held close. For a moment she said nothing, but then her voice came low and steady, carrying across the noise. Your people are different. You share when others turn away. My child lives because of you. Many will live because of you. This is why you are strong among the stars. Her words settled over him like a cloak, heavy yet warm. He realized then that the story was no longer his alone. It had become something larger, something that belonged to every voice that had risen with him. It was not a tale of one worker breaking rules, but of humanity showing itself to the galaxy, not through power or weapons, but through compassion. Days passed, and the station began to change. The old rules bent under the weight of new voices. Surplus food was no longer thrown away, but given to those who needed it. The guards no longer searched with suspicion, but stood more loosely, their eyes softer. Refugees who had once sat in silence began to speak again, to laugh weakly, to plan for futures they had almost forgotten. Life returned to faces that had been pale shadows. The commander remained, but his power was smaller now, his orders thinner. He ruled on paper, but the people ruled in spirit. And at the heart of it all was the memory of one starving mother who had dared to whisper a plea and one human who had dared to answer. The worker returned to his duties, still lifting crates, still walking the same corridors, but nothing felt the same. Everywhere he went, eyes followed him not with suspicion, but with respect. Some bowed their heads. Others touched their hands to their hearts. Refugee children ran past him laughing, carrying scraps of food as treasure. And always the mother and her child stood among them, their presence a quiet reminder of why it had all begun. One evening, when the docking bay grew quiet and the lights dimmed, the worker stood alone by a window looking out into the endless dark of space. Stars burned in the distance, cold and silent, yet he no longer felt small beneath them. He thought of Earth and the long history his people carried, of wars and hunger and mistakes, but also of resilience and compassion. Humanity had never been perfect, yet time and again it had chosen to rise by helping one another. That spirit had followed them into the stars, and it had saved lives here. He smiled faintly to himself, not with pride, but with quiet certainty. If the galaxy was to know humanity, let it know this part of them. Not their machines, not their weapons, but their simple refusal to let a child starve when food could be shared. Behind him, the mother's voice spoke softly. She had come quietly, the child sleeping against her shoulder. We will not forget, she said. He turned, and their eyes met once more. No more words were needed, and so the story ended not with the crack of rifles or the strike of punishments, but with the rising of compassion in a place of hunger. It ended with a human standing unafraid before authority, and with a mother holding her child alive because of it. It ended with the truth that across all worlds and all species, what made humanity strong was not power, but the choice to share even when the cost was great. The end.